Hello, I'm Olivia Mattis, and I'm so glad that you've joined us today to give us a little bit of your Sunday to learn about cartoonists who spoke out during the Holocaust. We have two speakers for you today. We have George Gustines from the New York Times, and George will also serve as a moderator. George writes about comics and graphic novels for the New York Times. Now, any New York Times readers know that the New York Times doesn't carry cartoons, but they do cover them as news items, and they did once carry cartoons, which is quite interesting. I found that interesting. And also, Mr. Gustinas is of Ecuadorian descent, and I only say that because he and I spoke about the fact that we had done a program at the Susan Mendes Foundation on Jewish refugees who found refuge in the country of Ecuador during the Holocaust. And he didn't know that story, so I was so proud to be able to teach something to a New York Times reporter. And in conversation with George Gustines will be Dr. Rafael Medoff, the well-known Holocaust historian, the director of the Wyman Institute. And he is a prolific author. He also has a very important blog or newsletter that I follow religiously. I urge all of you to do the same. And if you're interested in reading his writings about the US response or lack of response or insufficient response, however you want to put it, during the Holocaust, you will find his writings to be incredibly illuminating. And so all you have to do is go to his website, which is wymaninstitute.org, Wyman spelled W-Y-M-A-N, institute.org. Fill out the contact form, ask to be added to the newsletter, and you'll find that it will enrich your life as it enriches mine. So now I'm going to turn the floor over to George Gustines. George, welcome.
Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for joining us today. As you know, my name is George Gustines, and I'm very lucky to write about comics for the New York Times. It feels amazing to say that because when I was growing up, reading comics was not something that was really talked about. They were seen as childish and a waste of time. Thankfully, these days, comics are much more accepted. I've been reporting about the comic book industry since 2002 and has gone through many changes. Every time I write, I try to give readers a little bit of comic book history. My first big story was about a hate crime in an issue of Green Lantern, which allowed me to tell Times readers about how comics presented LGBTQ characters, which has made remarkable improvements over the years. I've also had features about the longevity of heroes like Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and Spider-Man. It's a tough assignment because I have to distill decades of comics to just 10 that I highlight for each character, but it's a lot of fun. One of my favorite pieces was on how superhero costumes have evolved over the years. I wrote about sexist outfits for female heroes and how film costumes influence the comic book looks of the same characters. My reporting has led me to meet Dr. Rafael Medoff, a historian and a fellow comic book fan, and someone who believes in the power of comics to be educational. I wrote about several comics he was involved with, including one about the Holocaust survivor, Dina Babbitt, an artist who was fighting for the return of paintings she created in Auschwitz. Babbitt died in 2009, but her daughters have continued to fight for her art to be returned. I'm eager to learn from Raphael how American political cartoonists, including Dr. Seuss, sounded the alarm about the Holocaust. Raphael, do you have any opening words?
Thank you, George. It's good to see you and to be with you. And thank you, Olivia Mattis, and to your colleagues and staff for organizing this program. My research into American political cartoonists during the 1930s and 1940s is part of the mission of the David Wyman Institute to explore America's response to news of the Nazi persecution of the Jews in Europe and the mass murder or genocide of the Jews. There are a lot of different ways to look at that story, the story of the abandonment of the Jews. And I'm sure most of you know that a good deal has been written about how the American government, the Roosevelt administration, responded to that news. And there's also been important research done on, for example, the news media's coverage of the Holocaust. In looking at political cartoonists, however, we want to consider a different perspective. We want to look at how those individuals were seeing the events in Europe during the 30s and 40s, the persecution of the Jews, and how they represented those events on America's editorial pages. This cartoon, which appeared in the New Orleans daily newspaper, the Times-Picayune, in 1933, shows what was a rather typical response in America to the rise of the Nazis to power in Germany. Most Americans were caught off guard by Hitler's ascent. Naturally, the United States was in the throes of the Depression, and not many Americans were paying a great deal of attention to what was happening in Europe, and Germany in particular. So when Hitler first was named Chancellor at the end of January 1933, a very common assumption, both in government circles and in the media, and as we see among political cartoonists, was that Hitler's extreme rhetoric would be reined in. Here you see a figure labeled Germany holding a kind of a ball and chain, which has the words "nice, safe, conservative Czechs." This represented the assumption that that German industrialists and other conservative elements in traditional German society would keep Hitler from getting too out of control. Notice that Hitler is depicted as kind of like he's a child. He has a toy sword. People just didn't take him seriously yet. Just one word about the figure representing Germany before we move on to the next example from my research. A cartoonist has a particularly difficult job in presenting some controversy overseas in one image. The political cartoonist does not have the space to explain his point the way the regular editorial writers do. A political cartoon is it's very much an editorial, except in graphic form. But what makes it so difficult, and why these cartoonists have always had to be so creative, is that they need to be able to convey an image which in one glance will tell the reader the essence of the point that the cartoonist wants to make. And as a result, and you'll see more examples of this as we go along, when it comes to representing a country, the cartoonist needs some kind of a figure who is sort of the stereotypical symbol of that country. We'll see cartoons, for example, where Uncle Sam is used to represent America. And in this case, they've taken a sort of what was in the popular mind, the stereotypical German housewife, an image apparently well known to Americans at that time, to represent Germany, so to speak. As we know, Hitler was not restrained by any conservative forces in German society. And within a very short time, he began implementing all of the well-known aspects of totalitarian rule that characterized Nazism, including systematic persecution of the Jews, massive discrimination, social ostracization, economic boycotts, and an array of official German government measures intended to make Jews miserable. Soon that led to a very substantial number of German Jews seeking to emigrate from Germany. If we can see the next cartoon, by the mid and especially the late 1930s, cartoonists in the American press, when they addressed the issue of the persecution of the Jews, began focusing on the phenomenon of refugees. I just want to briefly emphasize, a political cartoonist has a lot of topics to choose from every day. He or she looks at the news of the day or news of recent days and decides what issue seems to be the most important, the most compelling, where the cartoonist has the most to say. So there are a lot of different issues competing for a cartoonist's attention, and that was certainly the case in the 1930s. And thus, in my research and that of my colleagues, we did not find a large number of cartoons like the one I'm about to discuss. They tended to be few and far between, except in response to very specific events overseas that we'll see. But generally speaking, the search for cartoonists who spoke out about the plight of the Jews was often a search for a needle in a haystack. This cartoonist, Eric Godal, was a notable exception, but he was an exception for a very compelling reason. Eric Godal was himself a refugee from Nazi Germany. And it's an interesting backstory, which I want to share with you briefly because it ties into this very cartoon, which he drew for a popular magazine called Ken in the spring of 1938. Godal was on the Gestapo's hit list when the Nazis came to power. He was considered a dangerous and immoral artist, and he had to flee to Czechoslovakia soon after Hitler's rise. From there, he made his way to the United States in 1935 and began drawing cartoons for the American press. Godal left behind in Germany his elderly widowed mother. I don't say left behind in a pejorative sense. I mean, he fled the country and his mother was still there. Eventually, his mother became a refugee also. And I'm not going to tell you the ending of this particular anecdote until we get a little further in our program today. But my point here is that when Godal in this cartoon is representing the plight of Jewish refugees, he was soon going to be, in fact, drawing cartoons that had to do with the fate of his own mother. This particular image of the Wandering Jew, this is a play on a medieval Christian anti-Semitic legend that there was one Jew who was decreed that he would wander the earth for all eternity as a symbol of divine punishment for the Jews not having accepted Christianity thousands of years ago. So there was this idea, and it showed up a lot in the 1930s. It was still actually a widely believed kind of myth, which was often taught in Sunday schools as if it was a serious and maybe even to be taken literally kind of notion. But here you see the cartoonist has turned that anti-Semitic image on its head. What he is saying, in effect, here is, yes, there really is a wandering Jew, but it's not the wandering Jew of anti-Semitic legend. It's the real-life Jew looking desperately for some country that would open its doors to him. Could I have the next image, please? Shortly after Godal's cartoon appeared in the spring of 1938, the United States and a number of other countries decided to hold a conference in France, in the city of Evian in France, to address the refugee problem. It was a brief moment in the history of America's response to the Holocaust where many people were hopeful that the free world was finally going to do something to try to help the now hundreds of thousands of Jews who were trying to flee from Nazi Germany. This cartoon appeared in the New York Times. Some years later, the Times would end its practice of publishing political cartoons, but they still did in the 1930s. This was not a staff cartoonist. Sidney Strobe actually was a cartoonist for the British press, but the Times reprinted this very striking image. You see you have a Jewish refugee seated in the middle of a giant swastika, kind of covering the globe, with the hope of the Evian Conference as that sort of sunlight off in the distance. Notice something interesting, though, about the Jewish refugee figure. He's obviously a Jew. He's got sort of the stereotypical yarmulke. He's got a beard. Yet he's not labeled Jew. He's labeled non-Aryan. This was a common aspect of the language used in political cartoons in the 30s. Not always, but we'll see it again in other images. It was the preferred language of the Roosevelt administration and those who did not want to call attention to the fact that the people being persecuted in Germany primarily were Jews. The Roosevelt administration wanted to take the focus off of their Jewish identity in order to decrease the pressure to do something for the Jews. I don't believe Sidney Strobe or other cartoonists who use this phrase had that motive at all. In fact, I would say it's quite the opposite. In their case, I'm sure I feel confident that they sincerely believed that by sort of universalizing the nature of the problem, that it might attract more sympathy. Sadly, however, that was was not the case. Taking the emphasis off of the fact that Jews were being persecuted ultimately led to a reduction in the amount of interest that the public had in helping the Jews, because it didn't seem like it was really a problem where the Jews were being uniquely singled out for particularly severe persecution. I mentioned earlier that in response to certain specific events, a number of cartoonists would take a greater interest. And that was the case with the Kristallnacht pogrom in Nazi Germany, in which government-organized mobs murdered, rampaged, burned down hundreds of synagogues, shattered thousands of windows in Jewish homes and businesses, and instituted a reign of terror in Germany, which marked a pivotal point, a turning point in the Nazi persecution of the Jews. Up until the end of 1938, the mistreatment of the Jews in Germany consisted of economic discrimination and social isolation and occasional violence, but not in an organized, nationwide, government-sponsored sort of way. And Kristallnacht caught the attention of cartoonists, just as it was headline news throughout the world. Here's one example. As we're going to see when we look at some of the cartoons about Kristallnacht, political cartoonists were reluctant to directly challenge their government, to challenge President Roosevelt's response to the Holocaust, to criticize the free world for not doing enough. Later on, especially during the 1960s and 70s, political cartooning in America took on a much feistier tone, and challenging the powers that be became much more common. But let's keep in mind the 1930s were a different time. It was the Great Depression, and then very shortly it was a world war. And political cartoonists in general tended to be uneasy about being perceived as perhaps being unpatriotic. This is one of the few cartoons, though, the one we're looking at now from the Philadelphia Inquirer, one of the few cartoons that even sort of tentatively suggested that maybe this idea of European diplomacy, this is obviously a reference to Chamberlain and the policy of trying to appease Nazi Germany by offering them territory. The cartoonist is suggesting that maybe that approach is not working, because here you have the quintessential European diplomat holding out his outstretched arms, and then behind him you see the raging Nazi terror. Can I have the next image, please? In the daily newspaper, the Christian Science Monitor, we see an interesting theme. You see the headline of this cartoon is "Wanted, a Christian Answer." The exiled Jews are marching off into an unknown future. You see they're sort of crossing the globe, but they're heading towards a giant question mark. Their fate is unknown. Whether or not anyone will give them a haven is not clear. This cartoonist is suggesting there needed to be a Christian answer. Sadly, there was not. Could I have the next image, please? A few months after Kristallnacht, a ship carrying 930 German Jewish refugees approached first Cuba and then the United States, hoping that its passengers would be given haven from Hitler and Nazism. The voyage of the St. Louis is probably the best known episode in the history of America's response to the Holocaust. And this cartoon is one of the most powerful cartoon responses that I've come across in my research. Here you see that the artist Fred Packer has taken a well-known symbol and turned it around. Here you have the Statue of Liberty, the very symbol of welcoming the downtrodden and the oppressed to America's shores, and he has her turning her face away. The title of the cartoon was Ashamed, and an accompanying description explained that the statue is turning her face away in shame because now the watchword under the Roosevelt administration had become keep out, not come in. Way down there below you see a Jewish refugee ship sailing by, denied entry. Could I have the next image, please? Another especially striking cartoon about the St. Louis came from the pen of Edmund Duffy, who, by the way, was a Pulitzer Prize winning cartoonist, not for this particular image, but he was one of America's foremost political cartoonists. He drew for the Baltimore Sun, and he too took the concept of the wandering Jew, and here he has, as you see, the wandering Jew coming out of the smokestack of the St. Louis. Sometimes I found there were ugly reactions among cartoonists to these kinds of cartoons. If we can have the next image. This cartoon appeared in the New York Post also during the same week that the St. Louis was hovering off the coast of Florida, hoping to be granted refuge by President Roosevelt. Here you have the cartoonist, look, you see the caption way down at the bottom, another refugee ship. The cartoonist is suggesting here that the recent college graduates that spring were, in a sense, also desperate refugees because they're looking at a sign that says, "No jobs." And that quota is filled. Now, I don't mean at all to make light of the fact that America was undergoing a severe unemployment crisis and that, yes, indeed, many college graduates face an uncertain future in terms of finding jobs. But I would imagine that even at the time, many people found this cartoon jarring in suggesting that what temporarily unemployed graduates might face could be comparable to what Jews were facing at the hands of pogromists, mob violence, and other forms of persecution in Nazi Germany. We saw a moment ago a cartoon by Edmund Duffy about the St. Louis. I want to briefly share with you a different and especially disturbing cartoon that the same artist drew a few years earlier, the Baltimore Sun. The reason I want to bring this to your attention is because I want to comment on how these cartoons can and are being used in American classrooms today. I myself often lecture in high schools and middle schools about how we can learn from political cartoons about what Americans saw and understood and how they reacted to news of the Holocaust. But when you speak to a group of 15-year-olds in America today, the subject of Jews in Germany in the 1930s is a very distant subject. It's very hard for them to relate to it. I want them to have something more than just a lot of academic jargon. And so I show them another cartoon. I show them first the cartoon about the St. Louis by Duffy, and then I show them this horrific cartoon of an African-American man being lynched in 1931. Duffy was depicting an actual lynching that took place in Maryland, and which was the subject of great controversy because after the cartoon appeared, there were riots outside the offices of the Baltimore Sun by people who were angry at the newspaper for publishing Duffy's cartoon. They said it made Maryland look bad. Of course, Duffy's point was that this kind of horrific murder, that's what really tarnished the good image of the state of Maryland.
Yeah, I was going to ask, can you tell us about Dr. Seuss and his early career as a political cartoonist?
Yes, this came as something of a surprise to my colleagues and I when we first began the research on American political cartoonists during this era some years ago. It's not widely known, and we ourselves didn't at first realize it, that before Theodore Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss, became the world-famous, beloved author, creator of children's books, he was a political cartoonist for a New York City daily newspaper called PM in 1940 and 1941. His cartoons, as you see in this one and another one that we'll look at in a moment, they are the classic Seuss cartooning style. Many of his cartoons were very strongly critical of Hitler and the Nazis. He was very, very politically minded in that sense. PM was a politically very left-wing and very outspoken anti-Nazi publication. But one interesting thing that we discovered after looking at many Seuss cartoons from that period is that although he was very critical of the Nazis, he almost never commented on the Nazis' persecution of the Jews. And I don't have an answer as to why. I'm just mentioning it because the two cartoons we're about to look at by Seuss are two of only three images that we found in looking through hundreds of Seuss cartoons that had anything to do with the Jews. And even this one is a little bit indirect. But you see, it's a very powerful image. He's got the classic America First character. This is referring, of course, to the isolationist nativist movement in the late 30s and 1940-41, America First, that wanted to keep America out of any kind of conflict with the Nazis. And she's reading to these two children, the two children look like they could have come straight out of like The Cat in the Hat, don't they? And she's reading to them this book, Adolf the Wolf. You see the wolf is obviously Hitler. And she's saying that the wolf chewed up the children's bones, but those were foreign children, and it really didn't matter. He may have been alluding to a congressional bill 2 years earlier that sought to give haven to 20,000 German Jewish refugee children, but which was not supported by President Roosevelt and was buried in Congress. He may have been referring to that, or perhaps not. It's hard to know. But the cartoon obviously does powerfully capture this sentiment in America at that time that foreign children and foreign human rights abuses were none of our concern. I want to share with you one more Seuss cartoon, if we can have the next image. This is perhaps the most jarring image to emerge from our research on the mass murder period, the period from 1941 to 1945, when the persecution of the Jews changed from discrimination to organized mass annihilation. Now, you see that Seuss, in the summer of 42, was not aware of some of the methods of mass killing with which which the world soon became familiar, such as, of course, the gas chambers. That information was not immediately available in the West, but he was reading news reports about executions of Jews, and he latched onto this idea of showing them hanging from trees because he wanted to make an allusion to a very well-known poem from that era called Trees by Joyce Kilmer, which was often a staple of what was taught in high school in the course of studying English literature. So he took a something from American popular culture, which he figured most people would recognize, and he turned it around and put these, as you see, these very disturbing images of Jewish corpses hanging from those trees. And here you have below, you have Laval. Laval was the French collaborator with Hitler after the Germans occupied France.
During 1943 and 1944, American Jewish organizations pleaded with the Roosevelt administration to rescue Jewish refugees. How did the political cartoonists support them?
Well, here we go back to what I mentioned earlier, the phenomenon of American political cartoonists tending to be reluctant to directly challenge the president and the government. So we're going to see a few indirect ways in which they address those issues, George. But where we found a much greater willingness among cartoonists to challenge the Allied leadership was, interestingly, was in the Hebrew language press in British Palestine. If I could have the next image, please. Here we have a cartoon from a Hebrew language daily newspaper in Palestine, Davar, in which the cartoonist refers, and very acerbically, to the Allies standing aside and doing nothing to help the Jews. Now let me point out a couple of the features here. You see that the two lifeguards are meant to represent the stereotypical Englishman and Briton. The Englishman obviously is meant to be Roosevelt. You see he's got the glasses, and obviously his swimming trunks are the American flag. And the British fellow next to him, evidently meant to indicate Churchill. He has the stereotypical British sideburns. Actually, that was not Churchill, but still, the British flag, the pipe, that's sort of the quintessential Englishman, as cartoonists often depicted him. So here you have the two leaders of the free world, and they're standing aside. They're muscular. They are clearly able to do something. The title of the cartoon, the Hebrew word at the bottom, matzilim, It's a pun. Matzilim means rescuers, but it also means lifeguards. So here the two lifeguards are standing aside, and you see the little life-saving raft there at their feet, and it has on it the Hebrew word Bermuda. In the spring of 1943, the English and the American and British governments, the Roosevelt and Churchill administrations, convened another refugee conference. We talked earlier about the Evian Conference in France in 1938. Now it's 5 years later. They convened a conference in Bermuda, on the island of Bermuda, ostensibly to try to address the refugee problem. But tragically, in fact, it was really just a public relations stunt, and neither government had any intention of taking substantive measures to try to help rescue Jewish refugees. But in October 1943, remarkably, the little country of Sweden opened its doors to thousands of Danish refugees who were smuggled in boats from Denmark into Sweden and escaped the Nazis en masse just before they would have been rounded up and shipped off to death camps. Notice how the fellow who is leaping into the water is skinny. By the way, he is labeled Sweden. So you have Sweden. He's not like a big muscular lifeguard like the others. Sweden didn't have the power, the resources, the territory to save Jews, but they did it anyway. They were moved to rescue the Jews. You see the hands sticking out of the water, and if you look closely at the waves, you see swastikas. So here you have a cartoonist in Palestine commenting very strongly, powerfully on how, look at this, even Sweden is rescuing the Jews. The rescue of the Danish Jews was known at the time. The cartoonist was commenting on something he was reading in the papers. It wasn't a secret. And for those in America who were calling on FDR to do something to rescue the Jews, they began citing Sweden's rescue of the Danish Jews as a precedent. It was proof that Jews could be rescued. If there was a will, ways could be found. Could I have the next image, please? Here again, an image by Eric Godal. We spoke earlier about him in connection with that Wandering Jew cartoon about Jewish refugees. Here we have a cartoon which, more than any other, directly challenged the Roosevelt administration, although not bringing in the president himself. You see in the background the Capitol, symbol of Washington, D.C. You have two State Department bureaucrats. One is handing the other one a report about 100,000 Jews being killed monthly. And you see they're looking away, their noses are upturned, and the caption below says, refer to Committee 3, Investigation Subcommittee 6, Section 8B for consideration. Meaning, file it away, we're not interested. Now let me tell you the ending of the story involving Godal's mother. So Godal's mother was able to obtain an exit visa from Germany, and she booked passage on a ship that would bring her to New York City to be reunited with her son, the cartoonist, who she had not seen for a number of years. This is in the spring of 1939, so it had been 6 years since Eric had fled Germany, 4 years since he had arrived in the United States, and his mother finally was on the verge of being reunited with her son. Only the ship that she booked passage on was the St. Louis. And so Godal, sitting in New York, saw the ship that included his mother right there on the coast of the United States, begging for refuge and being denied. In my research, I found correspondence, letters that Godal had sent to Jewish organizations, pleading with them to try to do something to save his elderly mother who was on the ship. And I found a newspaper report from that week that the St. Louis was off the coast of Florida, quoting from one of Godal's letters. It didn't name him or his mother because they were afraid but there might be repercussions. But he or somebody leaked one of his letters to the press, and so there's a very heart-rending news clipping describing how his mother was waiting, hoping for a positive answer from President Roosevelt, which, of course, as we know, never came.
Raphael, those images are incredibly powerful. You've written many articles about the need to learn lessons from the Holocaust in order to prevent future genocides. Do you see any similarities between the work of the cartoonists in the 40s and how cartoonists today have responded to recent genocides?
I mentioned that the search for cartoons during the Holocaust period did not yield a very large number. Fortunately, happily, cartoonists in more recent years have given much greater attention to contemporary genocides. During, for example, the Darfur genocide, there were a number of very powerful cartoons in the American press and in newspapers around the world. I think many cartoonists appreciate the fact that they have the power of the pen to try to draw public attention to these kinds of human rights crises and to try to increase pressure on the international community to do something about it. If we could see the next image, I've often been struck by this particular cartoon about Darfur by Kevin Gallagher, who has for many years been the cartoonist for the Baltimore Sun, as a matter of fact, just like his predecessor Edmund Duffy, although this particular cartoon appeared also in The Economist, the British magazine. The reason this cartoon especially resonates with me is the parallel that I saw to the previous cartoon by Godal of the two State Department bureaucrats. And if it's possible to show the two of them side by side, you'll see what I mean. The common theme is the government bureaucracy and indifference. In the previous cartoon that we saw about the State Department, we saw two Roosevelt administration officials turning away. They're not interested. It's not their problem. File the news away in some filing cabinet. For me, the themes in the Darfur cartoon really echo the same point that Godal was trying to make. If we can look at the Kevin Gallagher cartoon again. So here you have three officials who represent something called the Emergency Action Team. And they're saying, we're from the UN. So here you have an international body, the United Nations, which was established precisely in order to address these kinds of international emergencies. And here you have, they're supposedly here to help, as they say. You see the dying figure representing Darfur there laying on the ground. But they say, first, before they can help, we need to borrow a pen, because they have with them these piles and piles of what the cartoonist sarcastically calls international tragedy forms that have to be filled out, the bureaucratic channels that have to be navigated, all the different kinds of delaying tactics that have to be overcome, the obstacles, the obstruction, before they can do something in the face of a genocide that was claiming hundreds and then thousands of lives each day. So in a sense, when we look at this cartoon about Darfur, we can easily conclude, well, how much have things changed? And in some ways, tragically, they have not. But ultimately, I think the lesson from looking at these kinds of cartoons and seeing these contemporary graphic images is that individuals who refuse to abandon their fellow human beings, individuals who choose to speak out, whether it's through a political cartoon or an op-ed in a newspaper or a phone call to a radio show or a letter to an elected representative or an email to the White House, those who speak out are our only hope. That's the only chance we have that international responses to future genocides will not be one of abandonment and indifference as the response to the Holocaust was.
Wow, what a discussion. You've just heard a fascinating discussion about the intersection between the Holocaust and cartooning. Dr. Medoff is part of a new generation of Holocaust educators who are using the world of graphic arts, political cartoons, comic books, and animation to teach about the Nazi genocide. And here at the Sousa Mendes Foundation, we are offering 2 of his books for you. And one of them is this amazing book called We Spoke Out, Comic Books and the Holocaust. And it's co-written by Dr. Rafael Medoff, Neal Adams, and Craig Yoe, with an afterword by the late cartoonist Stan Lee. And we are also offering this comic book called Karski's Mission, which is on the subject that we'll be addressing next week in next week's program. And this is a really beautifully done comic book. And then at the end, there is the true life history about Jan Karski and what he did to speak out and to inform the world about what was going on during the Nazi period. And as I was listening to Dr. Medoff, I couldn't help but to be grateful to the hero that we honor, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, the Portuguese consul in Bordeaux, France during World War II, who saved so many lives, and there was no red tape. He had his one instrument of rescue, and that was his pen and the stamp of the visa. And he saved my family, thousands of families, so many families. So my gratitude to him knows no bounds, and it's stark when you hear the types of stories that Dr. Medoff just told us. So I'm taking the floor now for a few minutes to tell you about our upcoming programs. And this will give you in the audience a chance to put your questions into the chat box if you haven't yet. George Gustines will be collecting your questions, and then we'll be asking them of Raphael after my announcements. So the first thing I wanted to say is that these two books that I just showed you, we're not actually selling them. We are in fact providing them as our thank you to any donors over the next 10 days who donate $100 or more to the Sousa Mendes Foundation to support our educational work, our educational programs. And after today's program, you will receive an email with all kinds of information, including about these books. Basically, next week's program is about Jan Karski. There are two ways to sign up. One is simply to sign up for the program itself. And the second way is to donate $100 or more, which gets you access to that program, which includes a very important film called Karski and the Lords of Humanity, and will also include these two books that we will send you signed and inscribed when you sign up for the program under the special offer of a $100 donation or more. It will prompt you to give your mailing address, and then we will reach out to you to find out what inscription you would like the books to have. Perhaps you would like to keep one book for yourself, offer another one to a child or a grandchild. Whatever you wish, we will be happy. Dr. Medoff will be happy to fulfill, and we are so grateful. So that is next week's program, is about Jan Karski, the man who tried to alert the world about what was going on in Nazi-occupied Poland. A very, very important story. In 2 weeks' time, we're having a program about Schindler. And for that one as well, we're showing a film, but not the film that you would expect. We're showing a documentary. It's called The Accidental Hero. And it's about Oscar and his wife, Emily Schindler. And it features a young Dr. Mordecai Paldiel from our board of directors, who at that time was at Yad Vashem in Israel. And so he is explaining in the film the significance of Schindler and what he did. You meet some of the people that he saved. It's quite a beautiful movie. And that is a free program, as are most of our programs. Today's program is free. The Schindler program is free, as is the one the following week, which is about the Philippines, the island of the Philippines, which was a safe haven for about 1,200 refugees from Nazi Germany during the 1930s. It's a story that most people don't know. We also have a film for that program called An Open Door. And we have the filmmaker, we have a man who himself was born in Nazi Germany, but found a safe haven in the Philippines. We also have the ambassador of the Philippines to the United States, who will be there in person. And we have an author who's written a book on that subject. So now we'd like to show you a trailer of the film that you'll be seeing next week for the Karski program. It's called Karski and the Lords of Humanity. Here's the trailer.
Karski had an air of moral aristocracy about him, and his narrative had all the appeal of the adventures of James Bond. His dream was to become a diplomat. He was smart, handsome, he studied foreign languages.
He was working for the Polish underground.
One of the leaders in Krakow gave me a microfilm. Gestapo counted this microfilm. They could prove you are a spy.
On May 5th, 1943, a secret telegram from Poland's foreign ministry reached the embassy in the United States.
Karski was on his way to Washington with a very special mission to inform President Roosevelt personally of what was going on in Poland.
I saw a lord of humanity. When you describe them, what is happening to the Jews, they will not believe you. What would help our cause if you, with your own eyes, see the situation in the Warsaw Ghetto? I couldn't take anymore, but I reported. We have a choice. We can choose to be robbers, we can choose to be good people. Now I go back 35 years. No, I don't go back, you know. It's not a...
If you find yourself in a circumstance, whatever it is, you can do something to make a difference. Let Karski's story be one of those that inspires you to try.
Good. So George, the floor is yours for the Q&A.
Great, thank you very much. I want to say how helpful everyone was in the chat, because people were raising questions and other people in the audience were trying to answer them, which was really nice to see. But Raphael, there's some question that several people had about the fate of the refugees on the St. Louis. People were debating what happened to them. So if you could help clarify that, that would be great.
Sure. After being turned away from Cuba, they had visas to enter Cuba, but the Cuban government declared them to be invalid. The ship sailed to the coast of Florida. It hovered there for 3 days. The Coast Guard was sent to make sure that they would not approach the shore and try to land. And after 3 days, they turned the ship around and began heading back to Europe. When the ship began its journey back across the Atlantic, the expectation of everyone, the Roosevelt administration, the news media, the passengers themselves, was that they were going back to Germany. It was a German ship. So they expected they were being sent back to the country where they had just underwent this incredible pogrom. What happened during the 2 weeks that it took to cross the Atlantic was that a Jewish organization, the Joint, negotiated an agreement with 4 European countries, England, France, Belgium, and Holland, to each accept a portion of the passengers. As a result, the refugees aboard the St. Louis briefly thought that they had been saved. The ones who disembarked in England, in fact, did survive the Holocaust, but that was just one small portion. The rest disembarked in France, Belgium, and Holland, which less than a year later were overrun by the Germans. And so St. Louis passengers who were taken in by those countries ended up being murdered in the Holocaust at approximately the same proportion as the other Jews in those countries who were deported to death camps and murdered.
There were quite a few questions about the editorial cartoonist process as well. One of them was like, did you find the political leanings of the publications swaying one way or the other?
Not in any way that affected the cartoons. The cartoonists who addressed the plight of the Jews in Europe, in no case that we found, ever approached it as a liberal or a conservative or a Republican or a Democrat. It was a kind of issue which should have been, and generally was, one which cut across party lines. And when you reflect on it, you have to agree. I mean, there should be some issues in our world that where we don't have to divide according to political or religious or cultural divisions. And surely genocide must be one of those issues.
Did you get any sense whether the cartoons were considered controversial, or was there any backlash against them for publishing them?
No, I can't say we found any instances like that among American political cartoonists. But again, political cartoons about the Holocaust or the pre-Holocaust persecution were few and far between. This was not a movement. It was not organized. These were individual cartoonists responding to the events of the day, the events that they saw in the news, and just responding as human beings should, with their hearts, wanting to use their talents as cartoonists to try to address a pressing humanitarian issue that was unfortunately being too often ignored.
Was there any one publication that perhaps printed more cartoons than any of the others?
I guess we could say that was PM, the New York City daily newspaper. PM in general was the kind of newspaper that went out on a limb. It was a very outspoken, left of center in its politics newspaper, which in its news coverage often challenged the Roosevelt administration for abandoning the Jews. It was one of the few newspapers at the time. It wasn't the only one, but there weren't many. And it was one of the few where historians look back and can see that, wow, they really took a different stance. They again and again, they published news articles and editorials and opinion pieces directly challenging the idea that the Jews can't be rescued, or that it's none of our business, or that there's nothing we can do. The newspaper itself was outstanding in that regard. And I guess then it's no surprise that they were willing to publish cartoons like Godal's, which were really unique in the sense that they were especially powerful compared to many other cartoonists in that era.
There was an interesting question here, and it plays to my love of graphic novels. Do you think Maus, how do you see Maus? Do you see it as a political cartoon?
Well, I would call it an extended political cartoon. I mean, we use the word political kind of broadly these days, and I'm using it in the sense of he's telling history. Maus tells the story of what his father underwent in the Holocaust. In a sense, that's not political; it's historical. But you could call it a very long form kind of political cartoon. I had the good fortune to collaborate with Maus's creator, Art Spiegelman, on a full-page political cartoon in the Washington Post some years ago. It was the 60th anniversary of the voyage of the St. Louis. So we did a full-page cartoon, like a comic strip actually, in which we showed some of the cartoons you've just seen here about the St. Louis. And we talked about what it meant for political cartoonists in 1939 to be addressing that tragedy. So it was a kind of a cartoon within a cartoon, so to speak. So, but yes, the short answer, I guess, is that Maus tells a powerful story, and it tells it through perhaps the most powerful medium we have today, which is the graphic arts.
And we've gotten a few questions about Eric Godal's mother. Can you just confirm what happened to her?
Godal learned in about 1942 or 43 that he knew that she had been among the passengers who were admitted to Belgium. That he knew. And then a few years later, around 42, 43, the dates are somewhat uncertain, he stopped receiving letters from her. And then eventually he was able to confirm through various sources that she had been deported to one of the death camps and murdered.
There was another sort of general theme that emerged where, do you think publications today would face backlash for publishing cartoons like this?
Well, I'm not aware of any backlash over cartoons that appeared with regard to, say, the Darfur genocide or the ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, or other examples of mass atrocities. So it seems to me that in general, political cartoonists today are given a free hand to address human rights crises. There have been very strong cartoons in the last couple of years about, for example, human rights abuses in China. And the Chinese government is very unhappy about that. But here in the United States, you're allowed to draw what you want to draw and to say what you want to say.
This brings us to the end of the Q&A. And so I'd like now to ask our panelists if they have some final thoughts. So George, let's start with you.
I just want to say thank you. This was super educational, and I really appreciate just how wonderful the audience was. You did most of my job for me by asking smart questions and answering a lot of them in the chat. So thank you very much.
Raphael?
I'd like to share very briefly an anecdote connected to one of the images we saw before. It was that very awful image of an African-American man being lynched in Maryland in 1931. When I speak about the political cartoonists of the 30s and 40s to high schools and to middle schools, I always share in advance with the teachers the images that I'm going to be presenting in their classroom. And it happened some years ago when I was scheduled to speak to a middle school class in Westchester County, New York, that the teacher raised a concern about showing that particular image. It is, of course, very disturbing. And she was afraid that it would be too upsetting to her middle school students to see that. And of course, I defer to the teachers. They know their students. I don't. I explained to her that why I wanted to show the cartoon, that I thought it was important to help students understand a connection between human suffering. It wasn't just Jews. It wasn't just African Americans. There's a tragic common denominator to the suffering of innocent human beings being persecuted in different countries at different times. Not to compare those persecutions, but to recognize the common humanity. So the teacher thought about it, and she got back to me shortly before the presentation and said she had changed her mind and she was going to go ahead and let me show that image. So I presented it alongside Edmund Duffy's other cartoon, the one about the St. Louis. And we had some discussion in the class about it. And a few days after the program, I received a very touching email from the teacher. She said that although she had worried that the children would be upset at that particular image of the lynching, and she said indeed they were upset, she said what it did is it sparked a discussion among the students and between the teacher and students, unlike one they had ever had, where it really evoked something, and it galvanized the students to talk about these subjects in a frank and an important way that she had not previously encountered. And so she was grateful that in the end, as it turned out, the image turned out to be a very powerful educational tool. I mention this because ultimately, why do we study the Holocaust, and why do we look at cartoonists' response to the Holocaust? Because at the end of the day, we want the next generation to not repeat the mistakes of those who stood idly by back in the 30s and back in the 1940s. And if we have a medium like cartoons, which students can grasp and they can remember in a way that they won't always remember when they just simply read a printed text, then we as educators need to use that method, whether it's political cartoons or comic books or animation or other kinds of graphic arts. We need to use that to reach the hearts, the minds of the next generation, because they will be the future leaders of America and the rest of the world. And we want them to remember the lessons of history so that they will do a better job than previous generations.
Thank you for educating us. Thank you for being so generous with your knowledge and your expertise, and explaining patiently what people were asking, the answers to what people were asking. So our two panelists have my utmost gratitude, and of course our large audience is so wonderful. I'm so glad you're here. I hope you will join us every Sunday for the rest of the summer. We have programs running until the end of August. We take a break for Labor Day. We start it up again the following week. Then we'll take a break for the Jewish holidays, and we have great programs ahead. So please do join us next Sunday and in the Sundays to come. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Bye-bye.